Okay, so what I want to talk about now is something that was actually brought up as a question by someone else. And so when I discussed the administration's attacks on science, I left out the part about why science was being attacked. And I think that could be a useful thing to discuss. The main thing that I want to sort of point out at the start of this is that the way science is being attacked really breaks down into two different sort of components. The first is people. So the people who are now being put in charge. And the second is the policy that those people intend to enact. And so it's important to view this from sort of both angles, and to also understand that there's more than one group of people who has an agenda in this. And so understanding both of those groups is going to be really important. So I'm going to start with the people involved in this. And I want to point out that Trump really has about 3 reasons that he is picking people to lead agencies. And you can see this across the spectrum. So it's not just in HHS, but it's really across his entire government. So first group are people he has worked with previously. We are talking about people who were in Trump Admin 1. And a lot of these people flew under the radar then. So we're not talking about the big people who resigned, but we're talking about people who were sort of flying under the radar, who were smaller, who had smaller roles, or at least roles that were not as public facing. So sort of chiefs of staff for departments and lawyers in those departments and people who were loyal to him. Now, he's picking these people because they have a track record of loyalty to him. It is not about their qualifications. It is not about them being best for a certain role, but it is about them being loyal to him and willing to enact the things he wants them to. Such a first group of people. You have a second group of people, and these are people to whom he owes a favor. The most notable example of this in HHS is RFK Jr. Dropped out of the race and endorsed Trump. He had initially approached Kamala, and she said, no, we don't want you. So he went to Trump. And in return for his support, Trump has provided him health and human services. And you can also see this sort of give and pull, this quid pro quo, if you will, across multiple different departments and for multiple different people. Again, RFK is the biggest example in HHS, but then you have Elon and Doge as the biggest example overall. Your third group of people being appointed to be in charge of things are people essentially given to him by the Heritage Foundation and by Republican insiders. So these are people that he does not personally care about, but are simply put on the list and he checks it off. Same thing he did with all of the federal judges in his first term. He had no real interest in them. It's the big appointments he cares about, but everything beneath that is either someone who is given to him by the Heritage Foundation or someone who is given to him by the Republican Party at large. One common thread connecting all of these people is loyalty, either to Trump or to the agenda. And that is really the biggest point for him. Now, there is, I guess, a fourth group, and it is a sort of... It's a higher profile group, it is a smaller group of people, and these are people who appeared on Fox News. We tend to hear about them more just because they were on Fox News, and their qualifications are slim at best, non-existent at worst. And because of these people, you sort of have another aspect in there, which is a mixed bag. A couple of his heads in HHS, I believe NIH and CDC, were both people who have pretty impressive track records as medical doctors, well respected in their fields, but had some disagreements around policy for COVID-19. And because of that, they sort of shifted into the right. Not necessarily that the people did, but that their opinions did, and they went where their opinions were valued. And so they showed up on Fox News, and because they showed up on Fox News, he knows who they are. He picked them. So when you're talking people, that is essentially the people he's putting in charge. It is not that he, in terms of staffing choice, is using his staffing choices to necessarily attack science. But the fact that his sort of criteria for picking people is not based on qualifications, that he is doing it based on loyalty to him, means that the attack is indirect in terms of personnel from people he has chosen specifically. Now, the people chosen by the Heritage Foundation and the people chosen by the Republican establishment, those people were chosen to attack science, and they are ideologues who are intended to do that fighting. So that's the human component of this. That is the staffing component of this. Now, we should talk about the policy component. And I will start by saying that when Trump thinks about these health agencies, what he specifically thinks about is COVID-19. That is the thing he is thinking about when these roll through his head, like a tumbleweed through an empty desert. And because of that, he dislikes these institutions. He wanted it to not be a problem. He wanted it to go away. He wanted to pretend it wasn't a thing that was killing north of 1 million Americans. But that was not the case. And scientists were not willing to let that be the case. So these agencies had an outsized role in sort of combating the things he would say. And because of that, he dislikes those agencies just by default. So that is his personal reason for wanting these agencies to have a hard time. To the extent that he thinks about them specifically in the way they wronged him, which is a pattern of his behavior that you can see throughout everything he does. Everything is about him, and it is about how he is a victim constantly. Either he is a victim or he is the only person who can save anyone from anything, and there is no in-between there. Now, why would Trump generally, and his administration more broadly, want these agencies and these authorities on science attacked? Why would he want them brought low, brought under his control, and muzzled? Why would he want them to be subservient to him specifically, and to anyone who was under him, so that they could provide edicts? Well, the answer to that is a little simple. The reason that he wants those brought under his control is because he can then control information. Now, what people will have noticed during the pandemic was that a lot of the information that we had, a lot of the best, most reliable information we had, was from the federal government. And that truth more often than not broke through the lies surrounding it. There was still a lot of misinformation, but generally, more people are vaccinated than were not. And when you want absolute control of something, when you want to be unquestioned, what you have to do is control information. If you run an entire presidential campaign on propaganda, if you run an entire presidential administration on propaganda, one of the biggest threats to your action is objective fact. One of the biggest threats is truth and expertise. And by gutting these agencies, by removing personnel, by then making everyone at that agency feel as though their job is dependent solely on your whim and not on their performance and not on the job they're doing, but on how you feel about them. You create a culture where people won't speak up and won't say the truth when lies are being spouted. By blocking all communication, you prevent information from getting out. You make sure that any message sent by what would have been previously an authoritative body of information is now whatever you want it to be. And we saw this extremely specifically when they were forced to return pages with a bunch of health information that then listed his own little political screed about transgender people. And it was this specific reason that they pulled it down. They pulled it down because they didn't want that information. And when forced to put it back, they put on their own political spin onto what should be nonpartisan, fact-based data. And the problem is that that is a through line in this whole thing. And as we move forward, what you're going to find is that the information control gets tighter and tighter because what an authoritarian regime, what a regime that wants to control everything cannot have is dissent from any place that might be authoritative. They cannot have dissent from any place that might be authoritative. And that is so important to recognize because that's why they are gutting things. Now, there is the other part of why they are gutting things, and it is this attack is entirely ideological. To be clear, scientists are some of the most nonpartisan, in public people you will ever meet. There's a reason that attacks on science have been happening so frequently, is because scientists do not like to talk about it in public. They don't like to acknowledge that science is inherently political because it is based on truth. And we are now in a world where truth is something that is opposed if it doesn't meet a certain viewpoint. And what this means is that you are getting a lot of that ideological bent coming in immediately into this administration. So a lot of what they're doing is straight out of Project 2025. And when you look in the healthcare section, the HHS section of Project 2025, you'll find a lot of those greatest hits, right? It's a lot of life begins at conception, abortion is murder, euthanasia is bad. All of these things that are based heavily on their religious beliefs that they want to inject into science, that they feel the need to add into science. And it is the point for them. Now, do I think Trump gives a shit? No, he fucking doesn't. If you think that man hasn't paid for an abortion, really? You think he hasn't? Him. Come the fuck on. So, he obviously does not give a fuck about that. He didn't give a shit about euthanasia. Hell, when he talked about his disabled grandnephew? His disabled grandnephew, he thought, you should just let him die. That's what he told his nephew. You should just let him die. He didn't even know what's going on. So he clearly doesn't give a shit about euthanasia, and it's not ideological for him. It's ideological for the people that helped shift him into power and the people who will still staff his administration. Because one thing that we know is that in the first administration, you had a lot more mainstream Republican support for Trump in his cabinet. A lot of that's gone. A lot of the nonpartisan people who would have joined his cabinet, especially on the military side, are gone. They will not interact with him, which means now the grip around him from those ideologues is even tighter. And there is nothing that regressive religion loves more than twisting science or lying about it to fit a narrative. Nothing they love more than saying, intelligent design should be taught alongside evolution. Because that's what they want. They want the two things to be equal. Hell, if they had the chance, let me be clear, if you give them that intelligent design is the same as evolution, their next fight is that intelligent design is obviously right and evolution is obviously wrong, so we should remove evolution from science education. That's what they want. It's the end goal. And it would be foolish to think that the attacks on science are done for anything other than controlling a narrative and pushing an ideology. You control the narrative by stifling fact and ensuring that authoritative bodies only issue the information you want them to in the way you want them to, whether or not that information is true. And ideologically, you simply enact policy that follows that prescriptive approach. And all of that is what is happening. You have a large group of people who are driven by self-interest, by fanatical devotion, and by ideological purity tests who are running these things to serve an end. That's what should be clear. They are not running HHS and its smaller bodies in order to help the American people, right? I mean, look at every other bit of their policy. It isn't that. It is to help the rich, and it is to provide an ideological outcome to the world. There's also this idea that they have been pushing about merit-based appointments, claiming that anyone who isn't a white male is a DEI hire. Again, we've been over my thoughts on DEI. But then they pick people who are less qualified than the people they're letting go. Right? Fucking guy in charge of guy who was in road rules is in charge of the Department of Transportation. A fucking drunk is in charge of the military. A former heroin addict who lied about having brainworms and who apparently eats roadkill as long as it's exotic enough. A bunch of people who aren't qualified for the positions they're in. And the people they're replacing are eminently qualified. For instance, look at the person currently in charge of the CDC, the acting director. Huge list of accomplishments. A public health professional. Doctor. Going to be replaced by another doctor, but one who is not as qualified. It's important to point this out, that I don't think Donald Trump has sort of an idea of what merit is. I mean, he might, but I want to be clear. The man inherited his money, and had he put what he inherited into just an index fund, he would have had more money than he had before he started grifting the American people and probably taking money from foreign governments through untraceable payments on his meme coin. I know he has a fucking meme coin. The fuck. But he would have done better had he done nothing. He failed upwards, a thing that money allows you to do. His children fail upwards, a thing money allows you to do. He staffed his first administration with family. Not based on merit, but based on how he felt about them. And All of that is his MO. It is what he does. The people around him also don't tend to understand merit. They're all people who got ahead because they started ahead. And it's really difficult to sort of square that circle. So, they're doing these things because it's what they always planned to do. It was always what they wanted to do. And they have the power to do it currently. Where we should have some concern is largely around a thing we saw in the first administration that we're not going to see as much of now. There was a lot of internal pushback from agencies to policies that were trying to be enacted in the first term that were illegal or unethical or unconstitutional, which is why the gutting has been so severe and will continue to increase as we go on. It is done to provide that chilling effect. And what it does as a side effect is removes expertise from organizations that desperately need it. To be clear, the biggest selling point of federal government employment for most people was one of two things. One, serve your country. And two, stable employment. But when your commander-in-chief serves his own ends, as opposed to the country, and when you can be fired on a whim, you don't have either of those things. They weren't in it for the money. They weren't in it for the prestige. And so now, getting people back after these purges is going to be difficult. It'll require such a bureaucratic lift to do. The laws that will have to be passed in order to entice people back into federal government service are going to be monumental. Because every promise it had is dying quickly. So we are in a situation where things will get more dangerous because we are letting people who understand what's happening go. We are making them leave. And it's fucked up. And there's not a lot we can do. But I think one thing that will work is what we've seen in sort of the last week, which is people going to town halls and voicing that opinion, their opinions, to their representatives. It's important to do. More so if they are a Republican than if they are a Democrat. It is important to go in and say how what is being done is wrong. How firing massive amounts of people is wrong. And I want to be clear about something. They have constantly cited, it's their new fucking thing. It's their new woke. It's their new DEI. And you know what it is? Waste, fraud, and abuse. Waste, fraud, and abuse. You're going to hear those fucking words from this administration, from this Congress, from these congressional Republicans and these Senate Republicans and the fucking Doge assholes. You're going to hear it ad nauseum until you're so fucking sick of it, you want to vomit. And let's break that down. Waste. Money is being spent on something it doesn't need to be spent on. It is wasted. You are overpaying for something. You are buying something you didn't need to buy. It's wasteful. Fraud. That money is being spent fraudulently. That is a crime. And abuse. That's something like self-dealing. So, when you hear them talk about all the waste, fraud, and abuse they're finding, I want to be clear. A lot of what they're cutting, which, to be clear, most of what they're cutting are contracts that are already complete, and so those savings won't exist. There's shit that they are putting on there in wrong amounts. There's stuff they don't understand. But when they call it waste, fraud, or abuse, what they really, really mean is something they don't agree with. That does not fall into the waste category, does not fall into the fraud category, and it doesn't fall into the abuse category. Now, if you'd like to know some stuff that does fall into those categories, I've got a couple of examples for you. So for waste, could be something like telling every federal government employee that they need to email Doge the list of 5 things they accomplished in the previous week. Take, I don't know, I'm going to put the math up here because I put the math up here because I don't have it off the top of my head. But what we're going to do is we're going to take the number of government employees. We're then going to multiply that by, I don't know, 5 minutes to answer it. And then we're going to multiply that by what the average pay of a federal employee is. And that is the waste that you're going to see in one bullshit email from some jackass who has no business in our fucking government. That's how much waste you have. Seems excessive, right? Yeah. Let's talk about fraud. Well, government fraud's harder to find since they fired most of the inspectors general. You can't just look at something and say it's fraud. That does sort of require like an audit and an investigation. You can't look at something and go, it says woke, and then you just sort of know that's fraud. That's not how that works. But if we wanted to talk about fraud, we could talk about, I don't know, a presidential meme coin. We could talk about Elon Musk lying about self-driving for ever at this point. We could talk about getting to Mars by 2025. Seems like we're probably going to miss that one. And yeah, fraud and abuse. Let's talk about abuse, because essentially that's what Musk is doing for his companies. The bullshit armored Tesla contract they tried to slip in there. The fact that Musk is going to contract himself to overhaul the FAA, that SpaceX will receive likely more contracts from NASA. We can also talk about him having access to information of his competitors that's stored in federal databases. And all of that is waste, fraud, and abuse. But you know what isn't? A program you don't like. That's not waste, fraud, and abuse. That's how fucking government works. There's plenty of shit in the federal government that I probably am not okay with us funding, but that's true for all of us. And it's all of our money, so it does make sense that we would all have different priorities, and those should probably be dealt with based on consensus. So, as you can tell, we're sort of in a weird spot. I wanted to talk to you really briefly about some plans going forward. Since you're here, figured why not. First, I've thought about unsung villains. The issue with that is a lot of these people, upon further digging, don't really have a lot in the way of accomplishments. They don't have a lot on their fucking thing other than being consultants. And since I refuse to get Twitter, I can't go dig through their tweets to find all the terrible shit I'm almost certain they've said. So, instead of focusing on them preemptively, it'll have to be reactively as stuff happens. But I will keep an eye on what they're doing. As I move forward and make different videos, I probably will have to do one for RFK. I don't want to, but I probably should, since he's now not concerned about children dying from measles, the first child death in the U.S. from measles in about 15 years. On his watch, a man who is, not exactly pro-vaccine. And keep in mind, he's also canceled the first vaccine advisory panel of his term. And so, need to drag a little bit more light onto a person that for sure has enough out there, but what the hell, might as well get on the bandwagon. I think our best bet is, like I said, to apply pressure where we can. And to remain informed about the things happening. Because a lot of what's being done will have more immediate effects, but some of those will be longer term. And it is incumbent on us to make sure that we are keeping an eye on these things to use as evidence against this administration when we're talking about this outside of this context, when we are talking about this to other people, to be able to say, did you see that thing? That thing happened because of this administration. Do not forget it. Do not forget the bad things, because bad things will come at a pace that is unnerving. And we cannot let things slide because there's so much of it. And like I said, I can't focus on everything, but I can focus on this. So we're going to keep fighting the good fight, because the alternative is to do nothing. And I think we all understand that that would be the wrong choice in this moment. I know there is an active attempt to chill speech around these things, but I'll be damned if it chills mine. So, take care of yourself, and I'll talk to you next week. Okay, bonus rant while I have you here. Be just a couple of minutes. I don't know if you saw Elon at CPAC, but I did, mostly through clips, because I have a really, really low tolerance for like secondhand embarrassment. And Jesus fucking Christ, that was some of the worst shit I've ever seen. I truly could not get through even just all of the clips. But I will point out, the man thinks he's bringing comedy back. Elon Musk thinks he's bringing comedy back. When you do shit that is so cringe and embarrassing that it's just painful to watch, that's not comedy. That's, I guess, a helpless ineptitude at being a normal-ass human. And to be clear, I do have to wonder which particular drug he was likely on while he was at CPAC. I mean, I know he probably shouldn't have been wielding a chainsaw, even turned off. It did it. I mean, shit. Javier Milieu looked like he was afraid he was going to die on that stage, and he gave him the chainsaw, which I believe was made in China, which I find fucking hilarious. But the man's sitting there talking about how, oh, the left, which I don't even know if it exists, the left, but the left, it is stifling free speech. They wouldn't let you talk, said the man who banned other right-wingers on his fucking platform when they disagreed with him. Said the man who works for or has an employee, I don't really know what the relationship is, but who sued Ann Seltzer, who sued a bunch of news networks, who really just doesn't like the press talking about him, who kicked the AP out of the press pool, is probably going to kick more news agencies out of the press pool, talking about how they're the party of free speech and how you can't be like on the left and support like rights, which feels fucking weird. All of that to say, I don't know how I, as a person, would be able to handle the weird dichotomy that I'm sure Elon Musk exists in, which is one, that you are the richest person on the face of the earth, and two, with all of that money, you can't buy any sort of cool. Like, how do you have enough money to buy small nations, but you don't have enough to be cool? Like, how fundamentally deficient are you if that's sort of where you land? How is that even vaguely something you could live with? I mean, shit, he went out there with his sunglasses and his chain, a t-shirt, that shitty hat, and I bet you he hasn't watched that fucking t-shirt since he's worn it for the last 2 weeks. I don't really think there's much I can pick apart there other than, I mean, that weird yell after he said chainsaw. Like, what the fuck was that even? But I want to do a special shout out to whoever let him get mic'd up and then go out there with a chain on so we could hear the fucking chain jingle every time he moved. You would expect more. I just feel like you'd expect more from the wealthy. But why should they try when an audience like that eats it up? But shit. Well, anyway, take care, and I will talk to you again next week.